Hey there, welcome to YouTube. If you are into poetry, if you are into literature, if you are into cultural history, then you've come to the right place. Cardboard Box Productions makes podcasts about all those things, so be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. Obviously, we mostly make podcasts, so you can also go to anywhere you get your podcasts, if it's a place other than YouTube, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can subscribe to our podcast feeds there. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley, and with my good friend Connor McNamara Stratton, we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare minute of your time, it would mean the world to us if you would give the podcast a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Those ratings and reviews help boost us up the algorithm and find new listeners.
And if you have suggestions for future episodes or comments on this one, you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
And you can also find us on social media. On Twitter, the show is @CloseTalking. I am @JackRossiterMunn, and Connor is @ConnorMStratton. On Instagram, the show is @CloseTalkingPoetry, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/CloseTalking. We also have a website, closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show, and Cardboard Box Productions has just launched a newsletter, Unboxed, and if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and all of the other literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes. On with the show.
Welcome to another episode of Close Talking. I am your co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And I am your other co-host, Jack Rossiter Munley.
We've got some excellent poems, as usual. Well, actually just one poem, but in a way, this one is in three parts, so maybe it approaches the plural.
The three parts are definitely different enough they could almost be a little three-poem triptych.
I like it. Yeah.
A larger work.
This poem for today is called Nursing Home, and it's by Vijay Seshadri. And this comes from his collection, Three Sections, which won the Pulitzer Prize in, I gotta look this up. This is horrible.
2014.
Fun fact, he's an Oberlin alum. So
you're in good company.
Yeah, we're doing good.
When do you plan on winning a Pulitzer Prize?
Oh dear.
2021, 2023.
Yeah, maybe the 2070s if the Pulitzer institution still exists, which, well, I guess I hope it does.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, but
I have a question based on the title of that book.
Yes.
Are there other poems in it divided into three parts? How important are threes to this work in general? Just before we read it.
That was a great question. It's like barely even split into three parts. It's not even like 1, 2, 3, but there's not really, it's actually a really weird book. It reads just like a bunch of poems, and then there's, I think what might be the second section is this long, basically prose personal essay that's called Pacific Fishes of Canada. And it's just about when he was like in the Pacific Northwest on a fishing boat. But it's very interesting. And then the end, sort of the last, is a long poem called Personal Essay, which is, maybe close to 20 pages.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and the tone is it ends, there's this really intense personal essay, long poem that like gets at, who am I, really, like what is consciousness, etc. It gets you in a trance. But then that very last poem, which is right after that, is called light verse. And it's just like a little ditty about, like the first line is, it's just 5, but it's light like 6. It's lighter than we think. And it's in this rhyming form, and it feels like very fluffy, but his good stuff is so good. And I really like this one poem, Nursing Home, which, as we've said, is split into 3 parts, and they are very different in style. And so I will read them. Nursing Home. 1. She had dreams 50 years ago, she remembers on this day. She dreamed about Bombay. It looked like Rio. She dreamed about Rio, which looked like itself, though Rio was a city she'd never seen, not on TV, not in a magazine. Brain scans done on her show, her perisylvian pathways and declivities choked by cities, microscopic mercurial cities made from her memories, good and bad, from the things she saw but didn't see, from the remembered pressure of every lover she ever had. 2. Unexpected useful combinations between cognitive psychology and neuroscience have fostered new observational protocols not only for elderly patients in the Lewy body pathologic subgroup, but those discovered across a wide spectrum of dementias and dementia-induced phenomena, including but not limited to normal pressure hydrocephalus, classical Alzheimer's disease, and the deformations in mental recognition and function. Dear, eat the soup with the spoon, not the fork. And the coruscating visions, who is that laid out in my bed? The spontaneous motor features of Parkinsonism. Synaptic patterns embodied in sparks, showers, electrical cascades, waterfalls, and shooting stars are increasingly revealing an etiology proximately to be fully established, and suggestive links between processes strictly biochemical and ideational, and linguistic explosions for which documentation has been massive while analysis has so far been scant. While an adequate conceptual apparatus still remains out of reach, progress across a broad frontier of research has been sufficiently dramatic to suggest possible developments that will lead both to therapeutic remedies for distressed elderly patients and to a synthesis among various disciplines that have heretofore seemed not just incompatible, but in direct conflict with one another. Certain coherencies have been unearthed that have truly startled our consensus. 3. She doesn't know any better than to act the fool. Is she dead? No, she's not dead. Is she dead? No, I'm not dead, and I don't want anybody to think I'm dead. Do you think it's funny? Wonder why she acts like that. Is she dead? No, she's not dead, and I'm not dead either. Is she really dead? No, she's not dead, but she's acting the fool. Are you really dead? No, I'm not really dead. I'm just acting the fool. I'll show you how I can act the fool. No, I don't think I look nice. I think I look purty. No, I'm not dead. I just act like I'm dead. What makes you want to act like she's dead? Do you think she's dead? Do you think she's dead, or is she just acting the fool?
Wow.
Pretty strange stuff.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I have so many thoughts.
Oh my God.
When I read this poem and hearing you read it. I mean, I read it aloud. One of the ways I always read these is I usually read them aloud to myself, but hearing you read it aloud, particularly that third section, the you becomes accusatory in a certain way that is very different than when you're reading it aloud yourself and are the accuser. It makes it so much punchier. It adds this quasi-aggressive confrontational tone that fits neatly with how I initially started putting together a reading of the poem, which is that the first part of it is sort of a poetic account of dementia or mental deterioration. The second part is like a medical scientific account. And the third part is a personal account, either from the viewpoint of someone who has it or someone who's viewing someone who has it. My personal reading is that it's somebody who has these going on, who feels almost a separation from herself and is almost in conversation with herself and with those around her, in this sort of fractured fluid consciousness sort of way. But the strength of that accusation, either if it's the individual with it sort of accusing themselves and getting frustrated with their inability to think through something simple, or with someone who's caring for them becoming frustrated and distraught at the condition that they see manifested, was just really powerful in hearing you read it as opposed to just reading it on the page or having myself read it aloud.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that makes me think, that I like starting with that, because one of the, I think that you've pointed out, the most striking aspects of this is the way the voice is. So you mentioned part one as like a sort of poetic account of someone with dementia, the second being medical, the third being personal dialogue. It's sort of like a play. There was a review in American Poetry Review that referred to it as sort of Beckett-like in its absurd repetitions. But those manifest themselves in terms of voice. What makes the second one medical or clinical is its medical voice and the diction that it uses. And similarly, the voice of the first one, with its lineated structure, but its sounds, etc., is a matter of voice. And then that's so interesting that the third, you talk about you hearing it from me versus you reading it, because that's sort of the game that it's playing, is like you don't actually know who's talking, and you know that different people are talking, but it's a section of multiple voices, although they also all sound like the same voice.
Yeah, the voice calls so much conspicuous attention to itself, but it's still so hard to pin down. But I don't, even in the first section, it could be easily the same person or the same viewpoint speaking as the third section, but it does not feel that way. There's still all of these she's, and it seems to be outside, but it just doesn't feel that way at all, because all of a sudden you have all of the I's that become interspersed, and now there's I and she almost as one unit, and all of that kind of language is just stripped out of the second part, and it becomes this completely clinical, almost like a textbook or a medical journal.
With like a few very strange exceptions. There's the
synaptic patterns embodied in sparks, showers.
Electrical cascades, waterfalls, and shooting stars are increasingly revealing. And the like deer, the parenthetical, deer eat the soup with the spoon, not the fork. Who is that? And then who is that laid out in my bed? So there is also like an uncanniness to parts of that voice. And it's interesting, this was pointed out to in a different review, I think Green Mountain's review of it. So in the first section, Blind goes, brain scans done on her show her perisylvian pathways and declivities choked by cities, which is a great few lines. But I was like, I don't know what perisylvian is at all. And I really tried to look it up. It took me a long time. And I eventually got to what this review put in more succinct terms, that it's kind of the speech center of the brain, that there's a strong language component. And so there's her pathways in her brain that have to do with speech are being choked by cities. And the cities part is very evocative. In terms of the what came before, we have Bombay, dreaming about Bombay, and dreaming about Rio, even though she doesn't really know about Rio, but that there's a imposition of something onto the speech. And so that makes me think about discrepancies between voice. It seems to draw attention to the various and like incomplete ways we have about talking about dementia. The second section is very clear because I think, I don't know, this is an experience I have where I read those things and I'm just like, I don't know what the fuck? Yeah, what the fuck? What's being said? But at the same time, it parades itself as like a neutral tone language, or a language that has no personality because it's the language of science or the language of medicine.
And it's interesting in contrast, it is sort of linguistically the hardest to penetrate, but it is the part that is supposed to be giving you information. The rest of it is supposed to be giving you, information and emotion, and it's clearly a poem, but the part of the poem that sort of mirrors this textbooky medical journal-y clinical language that is supposed to be like explaining to you what's happening is actually the part that's not helping at all, because you're like, I have to look up what half of these words are. And the way that you've mashed all of these words together, even the ones I understand, are in places that I don't appreciate.
You know? I know.
I wanted to hop back to the cities that you mentioned, because I love the mentions of Bombay and Rio in the beginning part. And I had a couple of thoughts, because it is the speech centers that they're talking about getting built up with these cities. And so it made me think that in her head, like she's from Bombay or she remembers Bombay, but when she talks about it, she's saying the word Rio. That's what I got from it. I don't know if that's accurate in the slightest, but to me, like just having known some people with these types of issues, like all of a sudden a certain word, they just can't say it for no apparent reason, or it turns into a different word every time they say it. All of a sudden a fork is a spoon or a knife is a flamingo. Like it just, that's the word that's now what it is. But also the idea of cities being what clog it, having the double meaning of, because it calls out, what is it, the Lewy body pathologic subgroup. And Lewy bodies are these protein buildups, city buildup, that cause these sorts of slow mental deteriorations. And so I thought bringing in the concept of cities, saying it was cities that are clogging her sort of abilities here, and then immediately at the beginning of this clinical section, throwing in that this is the Lewy body pathologic subgroup, was an interesting resonance.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's like, because it's like, so when you're talking about metaphor, there's like the thing that you're trying to describe. And so the thing that's in some way, it's like, this is like a metaphor that's like it's not just like a double layered metaphor, but it's like being come at from two different directions. So it works. Cities is a great like metaphor and image for the Lewy subgroup, as you're saying. Like it's a good sort of way to think about it in that way. But then from the other end, cities is a good actual like clog, like in the literal sort of the way that she's expressing herself in the nursing home, which I think is just why this poem is so good, is that that's such a implied move that he makes, because the Lewy body doesn't come in until the second section at all. And so the first section is just the brain scans choked by cities, which you then immediately think of the first part, the Rio and the Bombay. And then only in the second section, in a voice also that's like completely not about to make metaphor, is the one that's landing that second part of the metaphor. So that's really cool. And I like too how there's just, he's very funny. He loves rhyming in a way that sometimes actually seems traditional in a way that's like not hip, which is like a weird thing for me to say. But like in the first section, there's a lot of end rhymes, which are kind of like, I don't know, it's awkward. But
she remembers on this day she dreamed about Bombay.
Yeah, it looked like Rio. She dreamed about Rio, which looked like itself, though. And then line break, Rio was a city she'd never seen. Line break, not on TV, not in a magazine. And then we get another O, brain scans done on her show. And then there's like all these E's. And what's kind of cool is that he's rhyming declivities, like her perisylvian pathways and declivities choked by cities, microscopic mercurial cities made from her memories. And then there's an add rhyme, so good and bad, from the things she saw but didn't see, from the remembered pressure of every lover she ever had. So bad comes to had. And then there's an internal, like, remembered pressure of every lover she ever had. So that is very tight.
You also get the line from the things she saw but didn't see, going back to microscopic mercurial cities made from her memories. The C goes right back to the EEE section too.
Exactly. For some reason, declivities is my favorite rhyme part, because that's the least poetic word I could ever think of. And by choosing that and then emphasizing the sort of sound of it, he's drawing out a tonality to the word that no one would ever put in there. The fact that declivities can be paired with cities and memories, which are sort of more common.
At least for me, it gets me as a reader to sort of perk my ears up and pay more attention. Not that I'm not always, reading with attention, but it's like Warren Zevon as a musician is my favorite example of this, because he'll write a song called Porcelain Monkey about Elvis Presley and throw in the word regicidal, or he'll write Mr. Bad Example about a guy who just like does a bunch of sins, and he'll throw in Naugahyde Divan. And it's like these words that are great words. They're really cool words. They don't really show up in rock music, but when they do, and when they're in the hands of a skilled songwriter, it feels like it fits perfectly. Like, it doesn't call out to me as being wrong. It calls out to me as being interesting.
Yeah.
Sort of the way declivities does here. It's not necessarily a super poetic word, but it feels like the right word.
Yeah, exactly. And it hints at the more clinical language to come in the second section. Going back to the Lewy body part, because part 2 sounds, I think, probably when I read it, just sounded like gibberish. But it actually is saying something specific about, whether or not it's scientifically right. It's making actually a fairly clear claim that has implications for the poem, that there's combinations between cognitive psych and neuroscience that basically are leading to new understandings, of dementias, dementia-induced phenomena, etc. But this line, I think, has, so between processes strictly biochemical and ideational and linguistic explosions, for which documentation has been massive, while analysis has so far been scant. And then while an adequate conceptual apparatus still remains out of reach, and then there's sort of like hope for the future or something. And then this is interesting too, and to a synthesis among various disciplines that have heretofore seemed not just incompatible, but in direct conflict with one another. There's a way to read those things as the problem that the poem itself is intervening into, that there's the problem of language is a problem of analysis. So there's lots of documentation about dementia, but no one really has a good consensus or sense about like why it is the way it is. And then that these disciplines are not just incompatible, but in direct conflict with one another. All of these sections, the 3 sections, feel incompatible with one another. And so what Vijay Seshadri is doing is putting not necessarily cognitive psych and neuroscience together, but putting the lyric poem, the medical diction, and the sort of absurdist play dialogue in conjunction, which we then have to force to consider together rather than in discrete ways.
And isn't that how the experience of mental illness always goes? There's the combination of trying to understand it medically and find the best treatments, but there's also the personal experience of being with the person who is struggling with whatever the challenge is. I mean, those are the 2 things that are inextricably linked in the experience of it, both for the person who's experiencing it and for their loved ones.
Definitely.
Which makes this sort of an interesting holistic description of that experience in some ways.
Yeah, and maybe we can think more about this. I'm pretty with the poem for the first 2 sections. We have She Had Dreams 50 years ago. We have a speaker, maybe this is the speaker's mother. We don't know, but someone probably related to the speaker because the speaker is there in the nursing home with her. And there's a real, I feel like there's a poignancy at the end of the first section, that made from her memories, good and bad, from the things she saw but didn't see, from the remembered pressure of every lover she ever had. There's such a weight of personal history and love that emerges from the end of the first section that feels lost or distorted because of her mental state. That seems, very sad, and the speaker is able to observe that. And then there's a move to the medical. This is where we are in terms of like objectively understanding the situation. And then the third section, it's like funny and also like really jarring, because it's not just, there's the shifts, as Jack pointed out, that like the shifts from the I's and the U's and like like, no, I'm not dead. I don't want anyone to think I'm dead. Like, I'll show you how I can act the fool. What makes you want to act like she's dead? The twirling position of the voice is disorienting, but also there's so much repetition of acting the fool. Is she dead? The words become flat. I mean, the words itself become dead. In the first time that it's like, she doesn't know any better than to act the fool, I'm like, okay, I know that phrase, to act the fool. That could be a description of a really insensitive description of someone with dementia. But then by the end, there's just been so many fools and deads. They have no reference anymore. And now that I'm articulating that, that makes sense in terms of the project, insofar as part of it is attempting to expand or collect our various languages for talking about this subject. But then part of the other project perhaps is, because language is failing, let me just barrage you so many times with the same shit that people say so many times that you feel the deadness that the language actually has in terms of saying anything.
And you start to feel, in some way as the reader, the separation between language and meaning that is happening for the person with dementia.
Yeah.
And I think I puzzled initially over the repetition of the, is she dead? Am I dead thing? Because, like, clearly this person's not dead. But to me, it got down to the question of, how much are we still alive as ourselves when our minds are gone? Where is self, and how do you know if this person is there or not? Their body is there, but if their mind is gone, if they don't know who you are to them, if they don't know what anything is around them, are they still themselves? Are they dead? That seems to be the question he's going after in this last part of it, to me anyway. My only other thought is that it reminded me of the stellar episode of the now Netflix series Black Mirror, San Junipero. That is from the newest season, the one where the elderly woman in the nursing home takes part in a program that will upload your consciousness into a dream scenario, and you can pick the place where you want to go. And it's this seaside town called San Junipero that is entirely populated by dead people. It is, I think, a piece of art that is interestingly ruminating on some of the same questions and ideas. And not for nothing, beautiful episode of television, one of the best out there. And because it's an anthology series, you can just drop on in and watch it and not even worry about it. So if you're interested, check it out on Netflix.
Shout out Black Mirror.
It's the rare episode of the show that doesn't leave you terrified about the future of humanity and really distressed about the world.
That was my vibe. I was like, oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
Bringing it out in terms of poems generally, I like this example because when we talked about the great Emily Dickinson and her prairies, we were talking a little bit about how she's saying three contradictory statements and how that creates gaps, and the incoherencies or the contradictions sort of open up space and make the poem feel full. I feel like this is another version of that, but on a different scale, that instead of incoherent proclamations, we have incoherent voices that are made adjacent to one another. Because it's just language on a page and is just a speaker speaking a song or whatever, and there's less demand for something like narrative or something, which, not that there aren't fragmented prose narratives, but the opportunity for jarring juxtapositions of things as big as voice are opportunities that I feel like poems have that other forms of literature and art have a harder time doing.
They certainly don't do it as regularly.
And then there's the question of, what is the language of poetry? Poem language is always changing, of course, but because of the passage of time, Dickinson sounds like natural poem language to me. And I think this is a good example of a poet being very resourceful in the different languages available to him, and putting in medical terminology and putting in bare, jokey language, dialogue, rhyming, declivities, saying the word purdy, spelling it out, P-U-R-T-Y. Holy smokes.
I would have expected it to be with a DY personally. That actually gave me some pause, both because of the word and because it's per D, friend. I don't know anyone who's per T.
True. He screwed the pooch on that one.
I wouldn't go that far. I'm just saying, like, when I see somebody writing that word out, it's usually that they're like purdy.
Yeah.
Not purdy. Even when you say purdy, it sounds like you're saying it with a D.
No, I agree.
But that's besides the point. He's a great poet, and he won the Pulitzer Prize. So I should probably just run with it. Like,
he's killing it.
Roll with the brilliance.
Roll with the brilliance. I think we got to read it again.
Let's do it.
All right. Nursing home. 1. She had dreams 50 years ago. She remembers on this day. She dreamed about Bombay. It looked like Rio. She dreamed about Rio, which looked like itself, though Rio was a city she'd never seen. Not on TV, not in a magazine. Brain scans done on her show her perisylvian pathways and declivities choked by cities, microscopic mercurial cities made from her memories, good and bad, from the things she saw but didn't see, from the remembered pressure of every lover she ever had. 2. Unexpected, useful combinations between cognitive psychology and neuroscience have fostered new observational protocols not only for elderly patients in the Lewy body pathologic subgroup, but those discovered across a wide spectrum of dementias and dementia-induced phenomena, including but not limited to normal pressure hydrocephalus, classical Alzheimer's disease, and the deformations in mental recognition and function. Dear, eat the soup with the spoon, not the fork. The coruscating visions. Who is that laid out in my bed? The spontaneous motor features of Parkinsonism. Synaptic patterns embodied in sparks, showers, electrical cascades, waterfalls, and shooting stars are increasingly revealing an etiology proximately to be fully established and suggestive links between processes strictly biochemical and ideational and linguistic explosions for which documentation has been massive while analysis has so far been scant. While an adequate conceptual apparatus still remains out of reach, progress across a broad frontier of research has been sufficiently dramatic to suggest possible developments that will lead both to therapeutic remedies for distressed elderly patients and to a synthesis among various disciplines that have been heretofore seemed not just incompatible, but in direct conflict with one another. Certain coherencies have been unearthed that have truly startled our consensus. 3. She doesn't know any better than to act the fool. Is she dead? No, she's not dead. Is she dead? No, I'm not dead, and I don't want anybody to think I'm dead. Do you think it's funny? Wonder why she acts like that. Is she dead? No, she's not dead, and I'm not dead neither. Is she really dead? No, she's not dead, but she's acting the fool. Are you really dead? No, I'm not really dead, I'm just acting the fool. I'll show you how I can act the fool. No, I don't think I look nice. I think I look purty. No, I'm not dead. I just act like I'm dead. What makes you want to act like she's dead? Do you think she's dead? Do you think she's dead, or is she just acting the fool?
This is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars maybe? Those reviews help with the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners. And you can put anything in them. You can write whatever you want. You can just say, oh, this is a good podcast. I like this podcast. You could be like, hey, that Connor guy, he makes a lot of good points. Jack, why is he doing this outro so long? You know, get him off the mic. And whatever you feel like writing, head on over there, 5 stars, drop in the review. Do you have thoughts about this poem? Is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? Well, we'd love to hear from you. And there are tons of ways that you can get in touch with us. I mean, I guess you could drop it into an iTunes review. You could be like 5 stars. Hey, why don't you talk about insert name of poet here? But you can also send us an email. That's probably the best way to do it. closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com is our email address. Or you can find us on Twitter. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn. Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. And the show is at Close Talking. On Instagram, you can find us there too. We are at Close Talking Poetry. And we are on Facebook at facebook.com/close talking. We haven't gotten to TikTok yet, and we might never. Who knows? Anything's possible. Speaking of all those social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena, who keeps us active across the internet. And a thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time.